Hello and welcome to another gentle descent into the past. Tonight, we open the doors to a world once lost, now rediscovered through quiet storytelling. Perhaps you are lying still beneath the covers, or letting the last hours of the day melt away. Either way, I am honored to have you here. Tonight, we journey to the fog-shrouded hills of 19th century San Francisco, where dreams and determination collided with prejudice and perseverance. This is not merely another history lesson. This is the story of real people whose lives were forever changed by their courage to cross an ocean in search of something better, only to discover that the Golden Mountain held challenges they had never imagined. Before we step through those narrow alleyways and climb those steep cobblestone streets, let me paint you a picture of just how profound this transformation was. We are speaking of a time when hope knew no boundaries of distance or language, when families made impossible sacrifices for the promise of prosperity, and when an entire community would rise from nothing to create a world within, a pearl within, world in the heart of America's most dynamic city. The stories I'm about to share with you reveal a San Francisco that most history books prefer to keep simple. In this journey, you will discover how a single neighborhood became the beating heart of a diaspora. You will meet the characters who built this hidden empire, from the shrewd merchants who saw opportunity in adversity to the humble laborers who found dignity in the most demanding work. Most importantly, you will understand how courage and community transformed a collection of strangers into a family, bound by shared struggle and mutual support. What makes this story so compelling is not just the exotic allure of distant cultures and foreign customs. It is how these events reveal the eternal truth about human nature, about how we create homes out of the most unlikely places, and how determination becomes both a personal virtue and a collective strength. Let me take you back to where it all began. The year was 1848, and James Marshall discovered something glittering in the American River that would change California forever. But while thousands of fortune seekers rushed westward, chasing dreams of easy wealth, another group was already making a different kind of journey across the Pacific. Laborers, fleeing poverty and political upheaval in Guangdong province, began arriving in San Francisco Bay aboard crowded ships, carrying little more than hope and the clothes on their backs. Among these immigrants was a man named Chang Wei, though that was not the name by which most Americans would come to know him. In those days, many immigrants adopted simpler names that local residents could pronounce, setting aside their family histories like unnecessary baggage. Chang Wei had been a scholar back in Canton, well-versed in classical literature and mathematics. But here in Gold Mountain, as his people called California, he was simply another pair of hands willing to work for wages that established residents would not accept. Yet Chang Wei possessed something that would prove far more valuable than any gold nugget. He understood the art of patience and the power of community. Back in China, he had observed the merchant guilds that dotted the Pearl River Delta, not as a businessman himself, but as someone who recognized how cooperation could overcome individual limitations. He knew that people far from home, whether they were digging in mountain streams or laying railroad track across impossible terrain, would pay any price for a sense of belonging and mutual support. By 1850, Chang Wei had saved enough money to rent a small room on what would later become Grant Avenue. The space was barely large enough for 8 sleeping mats arranged around a central cooking area. But it was here that San Francisco's first informal community center quietly opened its doors. He hung a simple red lantern outside, nothing more than a colored piece of glass that cast a warm glow onto the wooden sidewalk below. To most passers-by, it looked like just another immigrant establishment. But to those who knew what to look for, that red light was an invitation to find fellowship and understanding in a land that often provided neither. The ritual was always the same. Newcomers would climb the narrow wooden stairs that creaked under their weight, following the rich aromas of familiar cooking that grew stronger with each step. The air was filled with the comfortable sounds of their native language. Conversations about work prospects, family news from home, and shared strategies for survival in this strange new world. Cowboy would greet each visitor with a respectful bow, learning names and stories, asking no questions that were too personal. Food was shared freely, usually simple rice dishes prepared on a communal stove that glowed warmly in the center of the room. Then came the conversations that would become as essential as breathing to thousands of San Francisco residents over the next 3 decades. Men would gather in small circles, sharing information about employment opportunities, discussing the peculiar customs of their new country, and offering advice to those who had arrived more recently. What happened next was pure community building. The cramped room would transform into a nexus of mutual aid, where lonely individuals became part of something larger than themselves. Someone might share news of a construction foreman who treated workers fairly. Another would warn about merchants who cheated on wages. Veterans of the gold fields would describe the realities of mining life to those still dreaming of instant wealth. Most importantly, they would simply talk, maintaining connections to their cultural roots while adapting to American realities. Word of Cowboy's establishment spread through the immigrant community like gentle rain nourishing dry earth. But the welcome extended beyond purely practical matters. San Francisco in the 1850s was a city of displaced people, and displacement knows no ethnic boundaries. Irish dockworkers who spent their days loading cargo ships began climbing those wooden stairs. German merchants, exhausted by the constant struggle to establish their businesses, discovered that conversation and shared meals could wash away weeks of isolation. Even some of the city's more established residents, people who wore fine clothes and carried themselves with confidence, began appearing at that red-lit doorway after dark. This was when things started to become interesting. As long as immigrant gathering remained confined to serving only their own community, most established San Franciscans were content to ignore it. After all, what did it matter how these foreign laborers spent their leisure time? But when respectable citizens began frequenting immigrant establishments, when business owners started wondering why their employees seemed more content and productive after visiting these places, the city's observers began to take notice. The first newspaper article appeared in the San Francisco Chronicle in 1854. The headline read, "Oriental Influence Growing in Our City," and the article painted a picture of curious cultural exchange that was reshaping San Francisco's social landscape. The reporter, who had actually visited several immigrant establishments himself, described places where East met West in ways that were both fascinating and unprecedented in American cities. But here is what that reporter truly understood. What most of the city's establishment had not yet recognized. The immigrants were not imposing their culture on Americans. They were creating spaces where different traditions could coexist and learn from each other. The real transformation was happening through voluntary exchange, where people discovered that shared humanity transcended cultural differences. By 1860, there were over 20 community centers operating in what was becoming known as the Chinese Quarter, a 6-block area centered around Grant Avenue and stretching toward the waterfront. Each establishment had its own character, its own specialties, its own unspoken traditions. Some catered exclusively to recent arrivals, offering basic services and simple accommodations. Others, like the Garden of Peaceful Harmony, run by a remarkable woman known as Madame Liu, attracted a more diverse and sophisticated clientele. Madame Liu's establishment occupied an entire 3-story building on DuPont Street, now Grant Avenue. The ground floor appeared to be a legitimate tea and herb shop, complete with wooden shelves lined with ceramic containers bearing elegant calligraphy. But visitors who demonstrated proper respect could be invited through a decorative door behind the counter and into a world that existed nowhere else in America. The Garden of Peaceful Harmony was cultural exchange elevated to an art form. The rooms were decorated with silk tapestries depicting scenes from classical literature, and the furnishings included embroidered cushions and carved wooden tables that represented months of skilled craftsmanship. Madame Liu herself was a figure of grace and intelligence, a woman who spoke excellent English and claimed to have been educated in Hong Kong before coming to America for reasons she never fully discussed. She moved through her establishment like a skilled diplomat, appearing at a visitor's side precisely when guidance was needed, vanishing again before becoming intrusive. Her ability to facilitate conversations between people of different backgrounds was legendary among those who frequented her establishment. But the most remarkable thing about the Garden of Peaceful Harmony was not its elegance or its mysterious proprietor. It was the clientele. On any given evening, you might find a railroad worker from Guangdong sharing tea with a wealthy Irish shipping merchant, both engaged in animated discussion about business opportunities. A German baker might exchange recipes with a scholar from Beijing, their differences in language overcome by their shared passion for their crafts. This mixing of cultures and classes fascinated San Francisco's established community more than anything else about the immigrant quarter. It was not just that Americans were experiencing culture, it was that they were doing so as equals, in spaces where the rigid social hierarchies that defined 19th century America were temporarily set aside in favor of genuine human connection. And that is when the complications began. Morning of October 15th, 1865 changed everything. That is when Police Chief Patrick Crowley received a visit that would reshape not just the immigrant quarter, but the entire relationship between new Americans and established residents for decades to come. The visitor was Theodore Whitman, one of San Francisco's most prominent businessmen, and a man whose shipping empire had made him wealthy beyond imagination. But on this particular morning, Whitman looked like a man who had not slept in weeks. His usually immaculate suit was wrinkled, his eyes were bloodshot, and his hands trembled as he placed a crumpled piece of paper on Crowley's desk. "My son," Whitman whispered, his voice barely audible. "He has been missing for 3 days." The paper was a note hastily scrawled in what appeared to be his 22-year-old son Robert's handwriting. "Father, do not look for me. I have found my true calling among people who understand the value of learning and wisdom. They always call, and I must answer." Chief Crowley had seen similar notes before. Family conflicts over cultural identity were becoming increasingly common in San Francisco's diverse population. But this was different. This was not some Irish dock worker or German immigrant laborer choosing between old country traditions and American customs. This was the son of one of the city's most powerful families, a young man who had attended Harvard and was being groomed to take over his father's business empire. "Where do you think he might be?" Crowley asked, though he already suspected the answer. "The Chinese Quarter," Whitman replied, the words carrying both fear and anger. "Those people have filled my boy's head with their foreign ideas. I want every one of their establishments investigated. I want to know what they are teaching our young people." What Whitman did not know, what he could not bring himself to acknowledge, was that his son's transformation had not begun in the Chinese Quarter. It had begun 2 years earlier when Robert was struggling with the pressure of living up to his father's expectations and the isolation that came with his privileged but emotionally empty upbringing. The family physician, Dr. Harrison Wells, had suggested that Robert might benefit from exposure to different perspectives and ways of thinking. "The boy seems intelligent but restless," Dr. Wells had told Theodore privately. Perhaps some engagement with the city's cultural diversity would broaden his horizons and give him a better appreciation for his opportunities. But what Dr. Wells had not anticipated was how profoundly Robert would be affected by his first visit to the Chinese Quarter. The young man had wandered through those narrow streets for hours, initially as a curious observer, but gradually as someone seeking something that had been missing from his privileged but hollow existence. Robert's first visit to a community center had been intimidating. He had stood outside Chang Wei's establishment for nearly an hour, too uncertain to actually enter any place that seemed so foreign to his experience. Finally, as the sun was setting and his loneliness was becoming unbearable, he approached a young man who was sweeping the sidewalk in front of a small shop. "Excuse me," Robert had stammered, his face flushing with embarrassment. "I'm looking for. I need to understand. Do you know where I might find people who are willing to teach someone who knows nothing about wisdom?" The young man, whose name was Chen Ming, had immediately understood what Robert was seeking. He had encountered many curious Americans over the past year, all with the same searching look in their eyes, all speaking in the same tentative language of someone seeking meaning beyond material success. "You come with me?" Chen Ming had said simply, setting aside his broom and leading Robert through a maze of narrow alleys to a wooden door, marked only with calligraphy characters. What Robert found inside changed his life forever. The meeting room was unlike anything he had ever experienced. The air was warm and filled with the gentle sounds of conversation, laughter, and the soft music of unfamiliar instruments. People of various ages sat in small groups, some engaged in what appeared to be lessons, others in animated discussions about literature, philosophy, and art. Chen Ming had led him to an elderly man named Master Fong, who spoke excellent English and seemed to possess the kind of calm wisdom that Robert had been seeking without knowing it. For the first time since childhood, Robert felt no pressure to impress anyone or justify his presence. The acceptance was unconditional, based not on his family's wealth or his Harvard education, but on his genuine interest in learning and growing as a person. Master Fong had introduced Robert to concepts that were completely absent from his formal education. The importance of balance in all aspects of life, the value of contemplation and self-reflection, the interconnectedness of all human experience. Most importantly, the idea that true success was measured not by material accumulation, but by the depth of one's understanding and the quality of one's relationships with others. For the next 2 years, Robert had lived a double life. During the day, he attended to his duties at his father's shipping company, playing the role of the dutiful son and heir apparent. But several evenings each week, as soon as darkness fell over the city, he would make his way to various establishments in the Chinese Quarter and immerse himself in studies and conversations. That fed his soul in ways that his privileged upbringing never had. The learning was systematic and profound. Robert studied classical literature, learning to read traditional characters and understanding the philosophical principles that had guided Eastern civilization for thousands of years. He practiced meditation and calligraphy, disciplines that taught him patience and precision. Most importantly, he participated in discussions about ethics, responsibility, and the meaning of a life well-lived. Now, 3 days after Robert had finally abandoned all pretense of his double life and committed himself entirely to his studies, his father sat in Police Chief Crowley's office, demanding action against the people who had, in his mind, stolen his son from their family. But Theodore Whitman was not the only powerful voice calling for investigation of the immigrant quarter. Throughout the 1860s, as more and more established San Franciscans discovered the intellectual and cultural richness that these communities offered, a growing chorus of concerned parents, business leaders, and politicians began questioning whether this cultural exchange was healthy for American society. The Reverend William Spear, who ran the Presbyterian mission, published a series of articles in the California Christian Advocate describing the immigrant establishments as centers of foreign influence that threatened traditional American values. His writings were filled with dramatic descriptions of young Americans who had supposedly been converted to alien philosophies and emerged with loyalties divided between their birth country and their adopted cultural traditions. What made Speer's accusations particularly influential was that he actually had spent time in the Chinese Quarter, unlike most critics who wrote about it from a distance. He spoke some Chinese and had visited several community centers as part of his missionary work. But his religious convictions and cultural assumptions colored everything he observed, transforming what were essentially educational and social institutions into something far more threatening in his descriptions. The reality was much more ordinary and much more beautiful. Most visitors to the immigrant quarter were simply people seeking knowledge, community, and meaning that they had not found in their conventional lives. Railroad workers attended evening classes to learn reading and mathematics. Irish immigrants studied Chinese medicine and discovered treatments for ailments that Western physicians could not address. German and Italian newcomers found in those meeting rooms a model of community organization that helped them establish their own mutual aid societies. Even some women, though in smaller numbers than the social critics claimed, found their way to the Chinese Quarter. Mary Sullivan was one of them, a widow who had arrived from Ireland with 2 young children. She worked long hours as a seamstress to keep her family housed and fed. The work was demanding, her hands constantly sore from the fine needlework required by wealthy clients, and she lived in constant worry about her children's future in a city that offered few opportunities for women without family connections. Mary's introduction to the Chinese Quarter came through another Irish woman who worked alongside her at one of the city's tailoring establishments. "It is not what you think," her friend had whispered during a brief break from their work. "They do not try to convert you to anything. They simply share what they know. You might learn something useful." When Mary finally worked up the courage to visit one of the centers, she was surprised to find that she was welcomed without question. The proprietor, an elderly woman known as Aunt Ming, treated her with the same quiet courtesy that she showed all visitors. There were no inappropriate advances, no attempts to undermine her faith or her Irish identity. None of the dangers that Mary had been warned about by people who had never actually visited such establishments. Instead, Mary found practical knowledge that improved her life immediately. Aunt Ming taught her techniques for preventing eye strain during detailed needlework, herbal remedies that eased the pain in her hands, and accounting methods that helped her manage her small income more effectively. More importantly, she found a community of women from various backgrounds who supported each other through the challenges of working life in 19th century San Francisco. But Mary's story illustrates something that the critics refused to acknowledge. Most people who engaged with immigrant culture did not abandon their own traditions or lose their American identity. Mary continued to attend Mass regularly, to raise her children as Irish Catholics, and to maintain her connections to the Irish community. The Chinese Quarter simply added dimensions to her life that had been missing, providing knowledge and friendship that complemented rather than replaced her existing loyalties. The problem was that stories like Mary's did not fit the narrative that San Francisco's establishment wanted to tell about cultural exchange. It was much easier to blame immigrant communities for corrupting Americans than to acknowledge that many Americans were voluntarily seeking alternatives to the spiritual and intellectual emptiness of their conventional lives. And so the drumbeat of concern grew louder throughout the 1860s. Newspaper editorials demanded investigation of the foreign influence that was supposedly undermining American youth. Politicians discovered that questioning immigrant activities was a reliable way to win support from constituents who needed someone to blame for their own sense of cultural displacement and social anxiety. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change everything, not just for the immigrant quarter, but for all new Americans throughout California and eventually across the entire United States. What happened next would demonstrate how fear and misunderstanding could transform educational and cultural institutions into symbols of threat, and how the promise of American pluralism could be tested by the realities of cultural change. But first, we need to meet the man who would become the most important voice for immigrant rights during this crisis. A figure whose story reveals just how complex and morally courageous the world of 19th century San Francisco really was. His name was Wei Zhelong. Though like most immigrants, that was not the name by which Americans knew him. Born in a scholarly family in Guangdong Province, he had arrived in San Francisco as a young man in 1868 with excellent education but no practical experience in American business or politics. Wei Zhelong understood something that most immigrants never grasped. Influence in America was not just about hard work or moral character. It was about understanding which institutions mattered, which relationships were important, and most crucially, which principles were genuinely sacred to American identity versus which were merely conventional preferences. By the time he was 30, he had transformed himself from a confused newcomer into the unofficial spokesperson for the immigrant community, a man who could articulate their perspective in ways that even their critics had to respect. But Wei's rise to prominence began in the most humble circumstances possible, working as a translator and cultural guide for new arrivals who needed help navigating American institutions. He had taken this work out of necessity, needing employment that would use his language skills while he learned about his new country. What he discovered in those early years was invaluable education in American character and society. Day after day, Wei helped fellow immigrants interact with government officials, business owners, and community leaders, observing the complex relationships that governed American social and political life. He memorized the names and faces of influential people, listened carefully to their concerns and priorities, and gradually developed an understanding of how decisions were made in San Francisco's power structure. Most importantly, he learned to distinguish between Americans who were genuinely committed to democratic principles and those who merely used democratic rhetoric to advance their personal interests. Wei's breakthrough came on a cold February evening in 1870 when he was asked to serve as interpreter during a city council meeting where several immigrant-related issues were being discussed. One of the council members was Thomas Morrison, a man who had been making speeches about the need to regulate foreign influences in the city while ensuring that legitimate cultural exchange continued to flourish. After the meeting, Morrison approached Wei with what seemed like a routine request for clarification about some of the testimony that had been presented. But as they talked, Wei realized that Morrison was genuinely interested in understanding immigrant perspectives rather than simply dismissing them. Here was an American politician who was willing to learn. Wei spent the next hour explaining the realities of immigrant life in San Francisco, describing the challenges that new arrivals faced and the ways they had organized to support each other. He spoke about the educational programs, the mutual aid societies, and the cultural preservation efforts that most Americans never saw or understood. Morrison listened carefully, asking thoughtful questions and taking notes. When Wei finished, the councilman was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "Mr. Wei," he said finally, "I think I have been looking at this situation entirely wrong. Would you be willing to help me understand how we might address legitimate concerns while still protecting the rights of your community?" From that conversation grew a partnership that would reshape San Francisco's approach to immigration and cultural diversity. Morrison became Wei's entry point into the American political system. While Wei became Morrison's source of accurate information about immigrant communities and their contributions to the city's development, this was how Wei built his influence. Not through confrontation or demands, but through patient education and the careful cultivation of mutually beneficial relationships. By 1875, he was consulted by business leaders, government officials, and community organizations whenever questions arose about immigrant affairs. But Wei's most important innovation was his understanding of American ideals. He recognized that San Francisco's elite would continue to support immigrant rights as long as they could see those rights as consistent with American principles of fairness and opportunity. Fear of foreign influence was powerful, but American pride in democratic values was even stronger when properly appealed to. So, Wei created what he called bridge institutions, organizations that demonstrated how immigrant communities could contribute to American society while maintaining their cultural identities. These were not separatist organizations that existed in isolation from mainstream society, but collaborative enterprises that brought different communities together around shared goals. The Merchants' Cultural Exchange, Wei's flagship institution, occupied a beautiful building on the border between the Chinese Quarter and the established business district. From the outside, it appeared to be a conventional commercial association, complete with meeting rooms, offices, and conference facilities. Inside, it functioned as something unprecedented in American cities, a place where business owners from different ethnic backgrounds could collaborate on equal terms. The exchange's membership read like a directory of San Francisco's most successful entrepreneurs. Shipping companies owned by Irish immigrants worked with Chinese import businesses to develop new trade routes. German manufacturers collaborated with Italian craftsmen to create products that combined traditional techniques with American innovations. Even some established American families joined the exchange, recognizing that cultural diversity could be a source of competitive advantage rather than social threat. What made the Merchants' Cultural Exchange truly revolutionary was how it transformed the economic dynamics of immigration. Instead of different groups competing for limited opportunities, Wei had created a system where cultural diversity became a business asset. Chinese merchants could provide access to Asian markets. Irish shipping companies could handle Atlantic trade. German manufacturers could supply European-style goods. And Italian craftsmen could offer specialized skills that no single community possessed alone. This collaboration served Wei's purposes perfectly. As long as immigrant communities were seen as economic assets rather than cultural threats, they were much more likely to receive political protection when conflicts arose. Wei had essentially created a constituency of influential Americans who had financial incentives to defend immigrant rights. But Wei's success also made him a target. By 1876, his influence in the immigrant quarter had grown so extensive that he was effectively operating an alternative power structure that rivaled the authority of established political institutions. This level of autonomy worried San Francisco's traditional leadership, who began to see Wei not just as an immigrant advocate, but as a challenge to their control over the city's development. The man who would become Wei's greatest opponent was Dennis Kearney, an Irish immigrant who had arrived in San Francisco with dreams of prosperity but had found only disappointment and economic frustration. Kearney worked various jobs, from teamster to factory laborer, never quite achieving the stability and success that he believed America had promised him. Like many working-class immigrants, Kearney had initially viewed other immigrant groups with curiosity and potential solidarity. They were all foreigners trying to build new lives in a challenging environment, and he saw no reason why they could not support each other's efforts to succeed. But as economic conditions worsened during the 1870s, as unemployment rose and wages fell, Kearney began to interpret Immigrant success through a different lens. The transformation began on a sweltering summer day in 1876 when Kearney was looking for work at the docks. He had been unemployed for several weeks, and his family savings were nearly exhausted. As he waited in line with dozens of other men hoping for day labor opportunities, he noticed that several Chinese workers were already employed, loading cargo with what seemed like effortless coordination. What frustrated Kearney was not just that these workers had jobs while he did not. It was the realization that they were probably earning less than established workers expected, which gave employers incentives to hire them instead of Irish or German laborers. The economic logic was stark and threatening. In a system where survival depended on daily wages, any group willing to work for less represented an existential challenge to everyone else. That evening, Kearney made his way to Murphy's Tavern, a crowded establishment where Irish dock workers and factory hands gathered to drink and complain about their circumstances. The conversation, as it often did, turned to the economic pressures that seemed to define their lives. Work was becoming scarcer, living costs were rising, and opportunities for advancement seemed to be disappearing. "It's not fair," declared Mickey Sullivan, a longshoreman who had been laid off the previous week when his employer hired a crew of immigrant workers at reduced wages. "We came here first, we fought for this country, and now we're being pushed aside by people who just arrived and don't understand American ways." Kearney listened to the complaints with growing anger, but his fury was directed at the entire system rather than any particular group of immigrants. He understood that Chinese workers were simply trying to survive, just as Irish workers were. What enraged him was an economic structure that forced working people to compete against each other while wealthy business owners profited from the competition. But as he looked around the tavern at the faces of his fellow immigrants, he realized that complex economic analysis was not what they needed to hear. They needed someone to blame, someone to fight, someone who could be held responsible for their struggles. "You're right about the unfairness," Kearney said, his voice carrying the natural authority of someone accustomed to public speaking. "But the real question is what we're going to do about it. Are we going to keep accepting whatever scraps the bosses throw us, or are we going to stand up for ourselves and our families?" The words felt both true and false in his mouth. Kearney did not entirely believe that other immigrants were the source of Irish problems, but he had discovered something powerful. Economic grievances could be channeled and focused in ways that created political momentum, even if the focus was not entirely accurate. Over the following months, Kearney refined his message, developing a rhetorical style that combined legitimate concerns about working conditions with cultural anxieties and identity politics. He began speaking at street corners and in public parks, drawing increasingly large crowds of working class men who found in his words an explanation for their struggles and a target for their frustration. The "American working man is being betrayed" became Kearney's central theme. But his speeches went far beyond simple labor organizing. He painted elaborate pictures of cultural conflicts, describing immigrant success as evidence of foreign conspiracy rather than individual effort, and community organization. He claimed that immigrant merchants were part of international networks designed to undermine American economic independence. He argued that cultural institutions like Ways Merchants Exchange were actually political organizations that divided immigrant loyalty between America and their countries of origin. But Kearney's most effective weapon was his ability to connect immigration to broader social and economic anxieties. When a factory worker lost his job, Kearney explained that it was because immigrant competition had made American labor seem expensive and troublesome. When a family struggled to pay rent, he argued that immigrant success was driving up property values and pushing established residents out of their neighborhoods. When young people seemed attracted to foreign cultures and ideas. Kearny blamed immigrant institutions for deliberately targeting vulnerable Americans with exotic alternatives to traditional values. The genius of this approach was that it contained just enough truth to seem credible while distorting the larger picture beyond recognition. Immigrant workers did sometimes accept lower wages, but that was because they were excluded from many higher-paying opportunities and had to take whatever work they could find. Immigrant businesses did sometimes succeed where American enterprises failed, but that was usually because they were more efficient, more innovative, or more willing to serve neglected markets. Immigrant cultural institutions did attract American participants, but that was because they offered education, community, and meaning that many people could not find elsewhere in their lives. By 1877, Kearny's speeches were drawing crowds of thousands, and his Workingmen's Party had become a significant political force in California. His rallies took on the atmosphere of revival meetings, with participants chanting slogans about American values and pledging to protect their community from foreign influence. The movement's symbol was a large American flag that supporters carried through the streets of San Francisco, representing their claim to patriotic legitimacy and their insistence that opposition to immigration was actually defense of American principles. The irony, which Kearny himself understood perfectly, was that many of his most enthusiastic supporters were themselves beneficiaries of the same immigrant institutions they were condemning. Murphy's Tavern, where the movement had been born, was located just a few blocks from several community centers that provided services to Irish families. Several of the workers who cheered Kearny's speeches had attended English classes or job training programs organized by immigrant mutual aid societies. But this contradiction did not weaken the movement. If anything, it strengthened it by providing participants with a way to resolve their internal conflicts about accepting help from the same communities they were taught to see as competitors. By blaming other immigrants for their own dependence on immigrant services, working-class Americans could maintain their sense of independence and self-reliance while continuing to benefit from community support systems that were more effective than anything provided by government or established institutions. Wei Xiaolong watched these developments with growing concern, but also with the calculating intelligence that had made him successful. He understood that Kearny's movement represented a serious threat to immigrant communities, but he also saw opportunities. Political upheaval created demand for his mediation services among nervous business owners who needed help maintaining productive relationships with immigrant workers and customers. Cultural tensions made his role as a bridge between communities even more valuable to officials who wanted to prevent conflicts from escalating into violence. Wei's response was characteristically thoughtful and multifaceted. On one level, he began organizing immigrant resistance to Kearny's movement, funding legal challenges to discriminatory proposals and coordinating with other community leaders to present unified responses to political attacks. But simultaneously, he expanded his network of relationships with established Americans, using a combination of economic incentives and personal appeals to ensure that he retained influential allies even as public opinion became more hostile to immigration. The merchants' cultural exchange became more important than ever during this period, serving as neutral ground where Wei could maintain business relationships with Americans who might publicly support Kearny's movement while privately depending on immigrant services and expertise. The exchange's elegant meeting rooms hosted conversations that would have been impossible anywhere else in the city. Railroad executives who employed immigrant workers at market wages socialized with politicians who gave speeches about protecting American jobs. Banking officials who financed immigrant businesses exchanged ideas with community leaders who worried about foreign influence on American culture. These gatherings revealed the fundamental complexity at the heart of San Francisco's immigration debate. The same business leaders who publicly supported restrictions on immigration privately depended on immigrant labor, immigrant customers, and immigrant innovation to maintain their competitive advantages. The same politicians who gave inflammatory speeches about cultural threats privately enjoyed the economic growth, cultural richness, and international connections that immigration brought to their city. The same working-class Americans who blamed immigrants for their economic struggles privately benefited from immigrant-provided services, immigrant-created jobs, and immigrant-led community organizations. But Way also understood that his position, however valuable in the short term, was ultimately fragile. The political forces arrayed against immigration were growing stronger in ways that threatened not just his business interests, but the basic rights and safety of all immigrant communities. What he needed was a way to demonstrate that immigrants were not the foreign threat that Kearney portrayed, but valuable Americans who deserve full protection under American law and complete inclusion in American society. His opportunity came from an unexpected source. The same democratic institutions that immigrant critics claimed were being undermined by foreign influence. In 1878, a state legislative committee arrived in San Francisco to investigate what politicians called the immigration question and determine whether new state laws were needed to address what many saw as California's cultural and economic challenges. The committee's hearings were supposed to be an objective fact-finding mission, but everyone involved understood that the real purpose was to provide political justification for restrictions that had already been drafted in Sacramento. The witnesses were carefully selected to present a predetermined conclusion. Immigrants were unassimilable foreigners who threatened American wages, American values, and American political institutions. But Way saw something that other observers missed. The committee members were elected officials, and elected officials could be influenced by the same methods that had proven so effective with local politicians. More importantly, the hearings were being conducted in public, which meant that immigrant communities would have an opportunity to present their perspective to a statewide audience. What happened next would determine not just the fate of San Francisco's immigrant quarter, but the future of cultural diversity in California for generations to come. The committee chairman was Senator Aaron Sargent, a man whose political career had been built on promises to protect California from what he called the challenge of uncontrolled immigration. Sargent had never actually visited immigrant communities, had never spoken to immigrant families, had never witnessed the institutions that helped newcomers adapt to American life. But he had read the newspaper reports, listened to the speeches of men like Dennis Kearney, and absorbed the cultural anxieties that had become central to California politics. When Sargent called the hearings to order on a cold February morning in 1878, the outcome seemed predetermined. The witness list included Kearney himself, along with a parade of ministers, police officials, and self-proclaimed experts on immigrant culture. Their testimony painted a picture of San Francisco, under siege by foreign influences that threatened everything Americans held sacred. Reverend Otis Gibson took the stand first, his clerical robes lending authority to words filled with moral concern. "Gentlemen," Howard wrote in his preliminary report to Washington, "we have found a community that has been systematically excluded from participation in American economic and social life, then condemned for the poverty and isolation that such exclusion inevitably produces." Howard's investigation also uncovered evidence of official corruption that went far beyond what Way's photographs had revealed. Police Captain Michael Crowley had been collecting protection payments from both legal and illegal immigrant businesses while simultaneously providing information to anti-immigrant groups about community activities and leadership. The captain's arrest sent shockwaves through San Francisco's political establishment because his detailed records implicated dozens of other officials in similar schemes. What emerged was a picture of systematic exploitation where immigrant residents were forced to pay bribes for basic police protection, while being simultaneously targeted for persecution by the same officials who collected those payments. But Howard's most significant discovery concerned the economic contributions of immigrant communities themselves. Working with Dr. Libio Tai and other community professionals, the General's team conducted the first comprehensive study of immigrant economic activity in San Francisco, and their findings demolished most of the assumptions that had driven anti-immigrant policies. The study revealed that immigrant businesses generated more tax revenue per capita than established enterprises, that immigrant workers had lower crime rates than any other population group, and that immigrant families invested more heavily in education and property improvement than the city average. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a physician who had been treating patients from all ethnic communities for over a decade, provided testimony that challenged another cornerstone of anti-immigrant sentiment, standing before Howard's commission in a small conference room overlooking San Francisco Bay. Her words carried the weight of professional experience that no political rhetoric could match. General Howard, Dr. Mitchell began, her voice steady despite the controversial nature of her testimony. I have treated patients from every community in this city. What I have observed contradicts nearly everything that has been said about immigrant health, work habits, and social behavior. She opened her medical bag and withdrew a collection of statistical records that she had been maintaining for years. These document health outcomes, vaccination rates, and treatment compliance among different population groups. The data shows that immigrant families are actually healthier, more compliant with medical advice, and more committed to preventive care than established residents. Howard examined the documents, noting the careful methodology and detailed record-keeping that supported Dr. Mitchell's conclusions. Dr. Mitchell, Howard asked, in your medical opinion, what accounts for the perception that immigrant communities represent health threats to the broader population? Her answer was devastating in its simplicity. General, the only significant differences I have observed are positive ones. Immigrant families place higher value on education, maintain stronger support networks, and demonstrate greater personal responsibility for community welfare. If there are health threats in San Francisco, they come from overcrowding, poor sanitation, and inadequate city services, not from any particular ethnic group. Dr. Mitchell's testimony was supported by Mary Chun, who had compiled educational statistics showing that children from immigrant families achieved higher graduation rates and test scores than the city average, despite attending underfunded schools and facing language barriers. The real crisis, Mary testified, is not immigrant failure to integrate into American society, but American failure to provide equal opportunities for integration. We have created separate and unequal systems, then blamed immigrant communities for the problems that separation creates. General Howard's commission also heard testimony from an unexpected witness, Patrick Carney, Dennis Kearney's younger brother, whose personal struggles had provided the emotional foundation for the anti-immigrant movement. Patrick had been located working as a translator and cultural liaison for several immigrant businesses, and his story revealed truths that his brother had never acknowledged. Patrick Kearney was not the victim of immigrant corruption that Dennis had portrayed. He was a Civil War veteran who had been struggling with what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress. suffering psychological wounds that military medicine was unprepared to treat. American physicians had offered him only alcohol and primitive medications that created more problems than they solved. His involvement with immigrant communities had begun when he sought alternative treatments for chronic pain and sleeplessness that conventional medicine could not address. "The immigrant community didn't corrupt me," Patrick testified, his voice barely above a whisper. "They provided me with healing methods, community support, and meaningful work when American institutions had written me off as hopeless. In their establishments, I found the first peace I had known since the war." But his words carried implications that extended far beyond individual experience. Patrick's testimony revealed the extent to which immigrant institutions served as informal social services for problems that American society was unprepared to address. Veterans suffering from psychological trauma, workers dealing with industrial injuries, families coping with poverty, and social isolation, all found in immigrant communities forms of support that were unavailable anywhere else in the city. Chen Ming provided the commission with insights into how these support systems actually operated. Far from the mysterious conspiracies described by critics, immigrant mutual aid societies functioned as comprehensive social insurance programs where members contributed according to their abilities and received assistance according to their needs. "We know our community members," Chun testified through an interpreter. "We know who needs help with employment, with housing, with education, with family problems. We try to solve problems before they become crises, to strengthen families before they break apart." Chun described a complex system of informal counseling, job training, and financial assistance that had prevented thousands of people from falling into poverty, crime, or despair. This was not charity in the conventional sense, but mutual investment where community members supported each other because their individual success depended on collective prosperity. General Howard's final report, released in September 1878, fundamentally challenged the narrative that had driven anti-immigrant sentiment in California. Howard's team concluded that immigrant communities pose no threat to American society, that their cultural institutions contributed positively to social stability, and that violence directed against them represented a greater danger to American values than their presence in the country. But perhaps most significantly, the report documented how anti-immigrant agitation had been manipulated by economic interests who benefited from ethnic division among working-class Americans. By encouraging established workers to blame immigrants for their economic problems, employers had deflected attention from their own role in creating conditions that impoverished all workers regardless of ethnicity. "We have found," Howard wrote in his conclusion, "that the immigration question is not really about immigration at all. It is about American willingness to live up to the democratic principles we claim to represent, about whether we can build a society where different communities strengthen each other rather than competing for survival." The report's recommendations were revolutionary for their time. Equal protection under law for all residents regardless of origin, investment in integrated institutions that serve diverse populations, and federal oversight to prevent local authorities from discriminating against minority communities. But recommendations were one thing, and political reality was another. Even as Howard's commission vindicated immigrant communities and exposed the manipulation behind anti-immigrant sentiment, the underlying economic and social tensions that had created the crisis remained unresolved. Wei Xiaolong understood this better than most. Standing in his office at the Merchants Cultural Exchange, reading Howard's report by lamplight as the fog rolled in from the Pacific, he felt both vindicated and soberly realistic about the challenges ahead. The Commission had provided legal and moral support for immigrant rights, But it had not changed the fundamental dynamics that made different communities compete for limited resources and opportunities. What Way had learned from the crisis was that immigrant communities could not depend on American institutions alone for protection and support. They needed to build parallel systems that could function independently when official systems failed them. But he had also learned something more hopeful. The crisis had revealed that many Americans, when presented with accurate information and allowed to make informed choices, were capable of overcoming their prejudices and working toward genuine cooperation. Mickey Sullivan's transformation from anti-immigrant agitator to labor organizer working for integrated unions demonstrated that ethnic divisions were not inevitable or permanent. Thomas Morrison's evolution from cautious politician to genuine ally showed that American institutions could learn and adapt when pressured by organized communities and moral arguments. Even Dennis Kearney's movement had ultimately failed because its contradictions became impossible to sustain once they were exposed to public scrutiny. The fog that rolled over San Francisco that autumn evening carried with it the same mysteries and possibilities that had always defined the city. In the narrow alleyways where red lanterns still cast their warm glow onto rain-slicked cobblestones, immigrant families continued building lives and communities that balanced preservation of their heritage with adaptation to American realities. Chang Wei, now in his 70s, still operated his community center, though it had evolved far beyond its original purpose. The simple room where tired workers had once sought fellowship and guidance had become the headquarters for a network of schools, medical clinics, and business cooperatives that served thousands of families. Wei Zhelong had achieved something unprecedented in American immigrant history: the creation of parallel institutions that provided complete social services while maintaining positive relationships with mainstream American society. The merchants' cultural exchange had grown into a model that was being replicated in cities throughout California, demonstrating that cultural diversity could be a source of strength rather than division when properly organized and supported. But perhaps most importantly, the crisis had created a new generation of leaders, both immigrant and American, who understood that their communities' futures were interconnected in ways that made cooperation not just morally preferable but practically essential. Mary Chun schools were now teaching children from dozens of ethnic backgrounds, preparing them for lives as Americans who would carry forward the best traditions from all their communities. Dr. Lei Bo Tai's medical practice had become a training center where physicians from different cultural traditions shared knowledge and techniques that benefited all their patients. The story that had begun with individual immigrants seeking opportunity and community in a strange new land had become something larger, proof that American democracy could evolve to embrace diversity without losing its essential character. The challenges were far from over. Economic competition would continue to create tensions between different groups. Cultural misunderstandings would require constant patience and goodwill to resolve. Political demagogues would continue to discover that scapegoating immigrants was an effective way to win support from frustrated voters. But the crisis of the 1870s had established important precedents. American institutions, when properly pressured and guided, could protect minority rights even against popular hostility. Different communities could work together when they focused on shared interests rather than cultural differences. And individual courage, whether displayed by Wei Zhelong standing before an angry mob or Mickey Sullivan defending an elderly immigrant, could change the course of history when combined with organization, evidence, and moral clarity. As the night deepened over San Francisco and the last red lanterns flickered in their windows, The city settled into the rhythm that had sustained it through gold rush and earthquake, boom and depression, conflict and reconciliation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities. But tonight the fog wrapped around immigrant and American homes alike. A reminder that all the city's residents shared the same sky, the same weather, the same hopes for their children's futures. The immigrant quarter would continue to evolve, sometimes facing hostility and sometimes finding acceptance, but always adapting and persevering because that was what immigrants had always done. They had crossed oceans and continents seeking better lives, and they had learned that the promise of America was not something given freely, but something that had to be claimed and defended by each generation willing to do the hard work of democracy. In the basement rooms where oil lamps had once flickered while desperate people sought escape from impossible circumstances, new conversations were taking place. Young people born in America but raised in immigrant families discussed how to balance respect for their parents' traditions with their own dreams of full participation in American society. Business owners planned enterprises that would serve diverse communities while contributing to the broader economy. Community leaders strategized about how to maintain their cultural identities while building the political influence necessary to protect their families and neighborhoods. The sweet incense that rose from family altars in those hidden rooms now carried not just individual prayers and private memories, but collective aspirations for a future where different communities could enrich each other rather than threaten each other, where diversity would be seen as strength rather than weakness, where the American dream would be large enough to embrace everyone willing to work for it. As 1879 drew to a close, the fog still rolled in over San Francisco every evening, just as it had when the first immigrants arrived with nothing but hope and determination. But now it carried with it the voices of children speaking multiple languages, the sounds of different musical traditions blending in the night air, and the dreams of families who had learned that home was not a place you came from, but a place you helped create through daily acts of courage, cooperation, and love. The story that had begun with strangers seeking refuge had become the foundation for something unprecedented in human history. A society where people from every corner of the earth could maintain their distinctiveness while building something together that was greater than any of them could achieve alone. And in that achievement, San Francisco's immigrant communities had not just found their place in America. They had helped America find its place in the larger human story of what becomes possible when people choose hope over fear, cooperation over conflict, and the hard work of building bridges over the easy satisfaction of building walls. The threads of Gold Mountain had been woven into a tapestry that would endure long after the individual stories were forgotten, a testament to the enduring power of human dreams and the endless possibility of American renewal. He declared, his voice echoing through the packed hearing room. What we face is not mere cultural change, but transformation so rapid and comprehensive that it threatens the very foundations of our community identity. Gibson had spent several years working with various immigrant communities in San Francisco, and his testimony carried the weight of supposed first-hand knowledge. He described cultural institutions as centers of foreign influence where newcomers were allegedly taught to resist American customs rather than embrace them. His most dramatic claim was that over 3,000 American families had been affected by what he called cultural displacement, where traditional values were being replaced by foreign practices. The audience murmured at this revelation, though Gibson offered no evidence to support such a specific and alarming statistic. But truth had become secondary to audience. To support such a specific and alarming statistic, but truth had become secondary to mature performance in these proceedings. And Gibson understood exactly what his listeners wanted to hear Police Chief Patrick. Crowley followed Gibson to the witness stand, carrying with him a leather satchel filled with what he claimed were documents confiscated during investigations of immigrant establishments. He held up each item like a prosecutor presenting evidence, explaining to the committee how these materials demonstrated the scope of foreign influence in San Francisco. In my 20 years of law enforcement, Crowley testified, I have never encountered anything so systematic, so carefully organized to maintain separate loyalties and resist American integration. These immigrant leaders do not just preserve their culture. They actively promote division and separatism. But Crowley's testimony revealed more about his own assumptions than about the reality of immigrant life. He spoke of immigrant communities as if they were a single coordinated entity controlled by foreign governments. He described their cultural preservation efforts as inherently threatening to American unity, their business success as evidence of unfair advantage rather than hard work and innovation. When Senator Sargent asked Crowley to estimate how many Americans had been influenced by immigrant institutions, the police chief did not hesitate. At least 5,000 residents of this city alone, sir. And the influence spreads daily through business relationships, social connections, and cultural attractions. Again, no evidence supported this claim, but the committee members nodded gravely and took notes, as if they were recording established facts rather than speculative concerns. Dennis Kearney's appearance before the committee was the theatrical climax of the hearings. He strode to the witness table with the confidence of a man who knew he was speaking to sympathetic listeners, his weathered face bearing the dignity of someone who had worked with his hands his entire life. Honorable Senators, Kearney began, his voice carrying the practiced rhythms of a veteran speaker. You asked me about the immigration question, but there is no question. There is only a clear choice between preserving American opportunities for American families and allowing unlimited foreign competition to destroy the livelihoods we have built. Kearney's testimony was a masterpiece of political rhetoric, weaving together legitimate economic concerns with cultural anxieties and patriotic appeals. He spoke of immigrant workers who accepted wages below what American families needed to survive, driving established residents into poverty and desperation. He described cultural institutions as recruitment centers where Americans were taught to question their own traditions and loyalties. He painted pictures of immigrant merchants growing wealthy while American businesses struggled to compete against unfair advantages. They come to our shores, Kearney declared, his fist striking the witness table for emphasis, not as people seeking to become Americans, but as representatives of foreign interests determined to transform America into something we will not recognize. The audience erupted in applause, and Senator Sargent made no effort to restore order. This was exactly the kind of testimony he had hoped to hear, the kind that would justify the legislation he had already decided to support. But as Kearney spoke, a small group of well-dressed men sat in the back of the hearing room, listening to their communities being systematically mischaracterized. Among them was Wei Xiaolong, dressed in an expensive American-style suit and taking careful notes in a leather-bound journal, unlike the other immigrant observers who seemed to shrink into their seats as the testimony grew more hostile. Wei watched the proceedings with the focused attention of someone studying a complex problem that required a strategic solution. Wei understood something that escaped most observers. These hearings were not really about immigration or economics or cultural preservation. They were about power, about who would control the story that defined immigrant Americans in the public imagination. And stories, Wei had learned, could be reshaped by those who understood how to present compelling alternatives. When the committee announced that it would hear testimony from immigrant community leaders themselves, most observers expected a parade of humble petitioners, who would apologize for any inconvenience their presence might have caused, and promised to better assimilate into American society. Instead, Wei had spent weeks carefully selecting witnesses who would challenge every assumption underlying the hearings. The first immigrant witness was Dr. Li Bio Tai, a man whose very existence contradicted the stereotype of immigrants as ignorant foreigners. Dr. Li had earned his medical degree from Harvard University, spoke perfect English, and had established a successful practice treating both immigrant and established families in San Francisco. His testimony began with a simple but powerful question. "Honorable Senators," Dr. Li said, his voice calm and measured, "I have listened to 3 days of testimony about the supposed problems created by my community. I have heard claims about thousands of displaced Americans, about systematic foreign influence, about threats to American institutions. But I must ask, where is the evidence?" Senator Sargent shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Dr. Li, surely you do not deny that cultural differences exist between immigrant communities and established American society." "I deny nothing that can be proven," Dr. Li replied. "But I question much that has been assumed. Yes, there are differences between communities. But are these differences the source of conflict described by previous witnesses, or are they sources of strength that benefit all residents of our city?" Dr. Li then did something unprecedented in the hearings. He presented actual data. From his medical bag, he produced detailed records of his practice over the previous 5 years. The information told a story very different from the one the committee had been hearing. In 5 years of medical practice, Dr. Li testified, "I have treated patients from every ethnic community in San Francisco. What I have observed is not cultural conflict, but cultural cooperation. Immigrant families learn American customs while contributing their own knowledge and skills. American families benefit from immigrant innovations in medicine, business, and community organization." The hearing room fell silent as the implications of this testimony became clear. If Dr. Li's observations were accurate, and there was no reason to doubt them, then the immigration situation in San Francisco was far more positive and mutually beneficial than the committee had been led to believe. But Dr. Li was not finished. He produced a second set of records, these documenting the economic contributions of immigrant businesses to San Francisco's growth over the previous decade. The data showed substantial tax payments, job creation, and international trade relationships that had enhanced the city's prosperity. "Honorable Senators," Dr. Li said, his voice carrying a note of quiet pride, "if you wish to discuss threats to prosperity, perhaps we should examine the benefits that immigration has brought to our community rather than focusing exclusively on imaginary problems." Senator Sargent tried to regain control of the narrative. "Dr. Li, regardless of these statistics, surely you acknowledge that rapid cultural change can be disruptive to established communities." Dr. Li's response was devastating in its simplicity. "Senator, I have read the histories written by your finest scholars. They describe America as a nation built by people from many lands, united not by common ancestry, but by common commitment to freedom and opportunity. If cultural diversity is a threat to America, then America has been threatened since its founding. If cultural diversity is a strength, then perhaps we should question our assumptions about immigration." The next witness was even more surprising. Mary Chan, a young woman who had been born in San Francisco to immigrant parents but spoke English without any trace of an accent. Mary had attended the University of California and had recently opened a school that served children from various ethnic backgrounds. Her testimony focused on something the committee had completely ignored: the actual experiences of second generation Americans whose families had come from other countries. "Honorable Senators," Mary began, "you have heard much about immigrant problems and immigrant threats. but nothing about immigrant contributions to American life. Allow me to share some facts that seem to have escaped the attention of previous witnesses. Mary then presented a detailed analysis of educational achievements among immigrant families in San Francisco, complete with school records and graduation statistics. The data showed that children from immigrant families were attending school at higher rates than the city average, achieving academic success that exceeded many established American families, and pursuing careers that contributed significantly to San Francisco's professional and business communities. The immigrant community in San Francisco, Mary testified, includes teachers, doctors, engineers, artists, and skilled craftsmen. We have built schools, hospitals, and cultural institutions. We have created businesses that employ both immigrant and American workers. We have contributed to the city's intellectual and economic development in ways that benefit everyone. Senator Sargent interrupted her. Ms. Chun, do you deny that maintaining foreign cultures and languages can divide loyalties and prevent full integration into American society? I deny that cultural knowledge is incompatible with American loyalty, Mary replied firmly. Speaking multiple languages makes someone more valuable to American businesses that trade internationally. Understanding different cultures makes someone better able to work with America's diverse population. Maintaining family traditions makes someone more grounded and stable, not less American. Mary's most powerful moment came when she directly addressed the committee's assumptions about immigrant women. Several witnesses had testified that immigrant women were either victims of foreign oppression or threats to American family values, incapable of participating fully in democratic society. I stand before you as living proof that immigrant families can produce educated, independent, contributing citizens, Mary declared. Yet the policies you are considering would treat me as if I were inherently inferior to American women, who may have less education and fewer accomplishments than I possess. The committee members exchanged uncomfortable glances. They had expected humble apologies and promises of better assimilation, not articulate challenges to their fundamental assumptions about immigrant capabilities and American identity. But Way's masterstroke was yet to come. His final witness was someone whose testimony would force the committee to confront the contradictions at the heart of their proceedings. Thomas Morrison, the city council member who had become Way's ally years earlier, took the stand reluctantly. Morrison was clearly uncomfortable with his role in Way's carefully orchestrated defense, but he understood that his political credibility depended on maintaining his reputation for fairness and objectivity. Councilman Morrison, Senator Sargent began, clearly puzzled by Morrison's presence on the witness list. What perspective can you offer on the immigration question? Morrison cleared his throat nervously. Senators, I have served in San Francisco city government for 12 years. In that time, I have worked closely with residents from every ethnic community in our city. I feel compelled to share some observations that may complicate the narrative you have been hearing. What followed was a careful but devastating critique of everything the committee had been told. Morrison testified that immigrant communities appeared in city records as among the most law-abiding, tax-paying, and civically engaged populations in San Francisco. Their crime rates were lower than the city average. Their business practices were more honest than many established enterprises. And their community organizations provided social services that reduced demands on city government. In my experience, Morrison said, his voice growing stronger as he spoke, immigrant families are among the most valuable residents of this city. They resolve conflicts through mediation rather than litigation. They support struggling members through community assistance rather than public charity. They contribute far more to civic order than they detract from it. Senator Sargent sensed that the hearing was slipping away from him. Councilman Morrison, what about the cultural institutions that have been described as centers of foreign influence? Morrison paused, and for a moment Wei wondered if the councilman would find the courage to tell the complete truth. When Morrison finally spoke, his words were carefully chosen but unmistakably clear. "Senator, I have visited numerous immigrant institutions as part of my official duties. What I have found are educational and social organizations that serve residents of every ethnic background. These are not the centers of foreign conspiracy described by other witnesses. They are community resources that strengthen families, improve skills, and build connections between different populations." The hearing room buzzed with shocked conversations. A respected city official had just contradicted the basic premise of the entire investigation, suggesting that immigrant institutions were community assets rather than threats to American society. But Morrison was not finished. If this committee is genuinely concerned about threats to community stability and prosperity, perhaps it should examine the economic policies that force working families to compete against each other for survival. Perhaps it should investigate the business practices that profit from ethnic division and social conflict. Perhaps it should consider whether the real threat to American values lies not in immigration, but in our willingness to abandon the principles of fairness and opportunity when dealing with people who look different from ourselves. The silence that followed Morrison's testimony was profound. For the first time in the hearings, someone had suggested that the problem might not be immigration itself, but American responses to immigration. Senator Sargent quickly adjourned the session, but the impact had been made. The committee's carefully constructed case had been challenged by witnesses who refused to play their assigned roles, by evidence that contradicted inflammatory claims, and by testimony that forced uncomfortable questions about American consistency and character. That evening, Wei hosted a quiet gathering at the Merchants Cultural Exchange. The building's elegant conference rooms were filled with an unlikely collection of participants: immigrant business owners who had funded the legal challenge, American allies who had risked their reputations to support community defense, and even Councilman Morrison, who sat in a corner drinking tea and looking like a man who had just survived a significant political test. But Wei knew that the battle was far from over. The legislative hearings had been a tactical success, but the largest struggle for immigrant acceptance in America was just beginning. The forces arrayed against diverse communities were too powerful, too deeply rooted in American fears and economic anxieties to be defeated by a single afternoon of compelling testimony. Indeed, even as Wei's guests celebrated, Dennis Kearney was addressing a rally of thousands of supporters in Portsmouth Square, his voice carrying across the night air as he promised that no legislative committee would stop the righteous campaign to protect American workers from unfair competition. They think they can confuse us with their educated spokesmen and their statistics, Kearney shouted to the cheering crowd. They parade their success stories before politicians in Sacramento, hoping to make us forget the thousands of our people who have lost jobs to unfair competition, the thousands more who cannot compete against workers willing to live in conditions no American family should accept. The crowd's response was thunderous, and Kearney fed off their energy like a man whose entire identity depended on their approval. "But we know the truth," he continued. "We know that every immigrant who refuses to adopt American ways completely is a threat to our children, our livelihoods, our way of life. And we will not rest until American opportunities are reserved for American families." As Kearney spoke, his supporters began lighting torches, their flickering flames casting dancing shadows across faces marked by economic frustration and cultural anxiety. The crowd began moving toward the immigrant quarter, their voices rising in a chant that would echo through San Francisco streets for hours. "America for Americans. America for Americans." Wei stood on the balcony of the Merchants Cultural Exchange, watching the torches approach like a river of fire flowing down the city's hills. He had won a battle of words and evidence, but now he faced something far more primitive and dangerous. The raw power of mob emotion fueled by economic desperation and cultural fear. The next few hours would determine whether his careful cultivation of political allies and his network of business relationships could protect his community from the storm that was about to break over the immigrant quarter. More importantly, they would reveal whether American institutions were strong enough to resist the kind of popular hysteria that had destroyed immigrant communities in other Western cities. As the first stones began shattering windows on Grand Avenue and the first angry shouts pierced the night air, Wei made a decision that would define the rest of his life. Instead of fleeing or hiding, he walked down the building's grand staircase and out into the street, where he stood directly in the path of the approaching crowd. What happened next would become legend in the immigrant community, a story passed down through generations as an example of courage in the face of seemingly impossible odds. But it would also mark the beginning of a new phase in the relationship between immigrant and established Americans, one that would reshape not just San Francisco, but the entire American understanding of diversity, community, and belonging. The crowd that surged down Grant Avenue that night was unlike anything San Francisco had seen before. These were not the organized political groups that had lobbied for immigration restrictions or the calculated protesters who had demonstrated outside government buildings. This was something far more emotional. Thousands of working-class families who had been convinced that their survival depended on driving immigrant competitors from the city. At the front of the crowd marched Dennis Kearney himself, no longer the disciplined political organizer who had built the Workingmen's Party into a formidable force, but a man possessed by the very anger he had so carefully cultivated in others. Behind him came dock workers carrying tools and lengths of rope, unemployed factory workers wielding improvised weapons, and families from the Irish and German neighborhoods who had brought their children to us, witness what they believed would be the salvation of their community. The crowd's first target was Chang Wei's community center, the modest establishment where the entire story had begun years earlier. The elderly proprietor had little warning, no time to escape, as dozens of people poured up his narrow staircase with torches and crowbars. Chang Wei stood behind his small reception desk, his weathered hands steady despite the chaos around him, his voice calm when he spoke. "This is my home," he said in carefully pronounced English. "I harm no one. I break no law." His words were lost in the roar of destruction as the crowd overturned his furniture, smashed his cooking equipment, and began tearing down the calligraphy scrolls that had decorated his walls. Chang Wei himself might have been seriously injured if not for the intervention of an unlikely defender, Mickey Sullivan, the same Irish dock worker who had first complained about immigrant competition in Murphy's Tavern years earlier. Sullivan had been one of Chang Wei's regular visitors for the past 3 years, attending English classes and business workshops that had helped him improve his job prospects and economic situation. As he watched his fellow protesters preparing to assault the old man, something in Sullivan's conscience rebelled against the violence he had helped to unleash. "Leave him alone," Sullivan shouted, pushing through the crowd to stand between Chang Wei and his attackers. "He's just an old man trying to help people. This isn't what we came here to do." But Sullivan's intervention only enraged the crowd further. "Immigrant lover," someone screamed from the back of the group. "He's been corrupted by their foreign ideas." Within minutes, Sullivan found himself fighting not just to protect Chang Wei, but to save his own life as the crowd turned on anyone who showed sympathy for the immigrants. The two men, one Irish and one Chinese, stood back to back in the crowded room as dozens of angry faces pressed closer around them. They might both have been seriously hurt, if not for the arrival of Wei Xiaolong and his security team, a carefully selected group of immigrant and American men who had been preparing for this moment for months. Wei had anticipated that his political victories would provoke violent retaliation, and he had quietly assembled what amounted to a neighborhood watch equipped with modern communication methods and trained in conflict de-escalation techniques. The intervention that echoed through Chang Wei's establishment that night marked a turning point in the relationship between immigrant and established communities in San Francisco. For the first time, immigrant Americans were responding to organized hostility with organized defense rather than simply enduring whatever treatment was inflicted upon them. Wei's team moved through the chaos with disciplined coordination, using superior organization and communication to separate the most aggressive protesters from the crowd and guide the majority toward peaceful dispersal. But Wei himself had a different objective. Instead of simply repelling the attack, he was seeking Dennis Kearney. Understanding that confronting the movement's leader was the only way to break the cycle of escalation that threatened to destroy both communities. He found Kearney 3 blocks away, standing in Portsmouth Square and addressing a second wave of supporters who were preparing to join the assault on the immigrant quarter. The labor organizer was in his element, his voice carrying across the crowd as he painted pictures of immigrant success as American betrayal. "They think their money and their political connections can save them," Kearney shouted, unaware that Wei was approaching through the crowd. "They think they can buy respectability and make us forget what they've done to our opportunities." Wei moved closer, his hand resting on a small camera concealed beneath his coat. He had acquired the device from a German photographer who had taught him how to document events with portable equipment. Instead of confronting Kearney directly, Wei began systematically photographing the faces in the crowd, creating a permanent record of exactly who had participated in the night's violence. The implications were clear to everyone who noticed the camera's flash illuminating their features. Wei now possessed evidence that could identify the participants in illegal activities, proof that could be used to hold people accountable for their actions through legal rather than violent means. When Kearney finally noticed Wei standing in the crowd, the two men locked eyes across the square in a moment that seemed to last forever. Each understood exactly what the other represented. Kearney embodied the power of popular emotion and mass action, while Wei represented the more subtle but ultimately more sustainable influence of organization, evidence, and legal process. "There he is," Kearney suddenly shouted, pointing directly at Wei. "The foreign agitator himself, the man who has corrupted our institutions and divided our community." The crowd began moving toward Wei, but he made no attempt to flee. Instead, he climbed onto a wooden crate and began to speak, his voice carrying the same authority that had made him successful in both business and community organizing. "Citizens of San Francisco," Wei called out, his English clear and precise despite his accent. "You have heard many accusations tonight about my community and our contributions to this city. Allow me to offer you some facts that your leaders have chosen not to share." The crowd hesitated, unsure how to respond to this unexpected development. They had come expecting to drive immigrants from the city through intimidation and force, not to engage in public debate with one of their supposed enemies. Wei seized the moment of uncertainty to continue his speech. "Mr. Kearney tells you that immigrant workers have stolen your jobs, but who hired those workers? Who decided that experienced immigrants were more valuable than inexperienced Americans? Was it immigrant business owners, or was it American employers seeking to maximize their profits?" Murmurs began to ripple through the crowd as Wei's words sank in. He was forcing them to confront an uncomfortable truth. Immigrants had not imposed themselves on San Francisco's economy. They had been recruited by American businesses seeking skilled workers and reliable employees. Mr. Kearney tells you that immigrant success proves unfair advantage, Wei continued, his voice growing stronger. But who are the customers of immigrant businesses? Are they only other immigrants, or are they Americans who choose immigrant services because they are superior to the alternatives? Wei then did something that shocked everyone present. He began reading from a list, identifying specific American businesses that had prospered through partnerships with immigrant enterprises, and specific American families who had benefited from immigrant-provided services. Morrison Construction Company, Wei called out. Do you deny that your business has grown by 30% since hiring immigrant engineers and craftsmen? Thomas Morrison, who was present in the crowd, looked around nervously but said nothing. Sullivan Family Services, Wei continued. Do you deny that your success is built on techniques learned from immigrant business organizations? Mickey Sullivan, who was still covered in dust from the fight in Chang Wei's establishment, looked around at his fellow protesters with growing understanding. It's true, he said quietly, then louder. It's all true. We've been blaming them for our own choices. The crowd began to fragment as Wei's revelation sank in. Some supporters remained loyal to Kearney, but others started drifting away, confused, and ashamed by the contradictions that Wei had exposed. The night that was supposed to end with the destruction of the immigrant quarter and the complete expulsion of foreign influence from San Francisco was instead revealing the complex web of interdependence that bound all communities together. But Kearney was not finished. As he watched his support crumbling, his rhetoric became even more desperate and emotional. Don't let him confuse you with his statistics, he screamed, his voice cracking with strain. This is exactly what they do. They use our own success against us. They prosper from our generosity and then claim credit for our achievements. The labor leader's words struck a chord with the most committed members of his movement, people who had invested too much of their identity and anti-immigrant sentiment to abandon it easily. About 200 supporters rallied around Kearney, forming a core of true believers who were immune to Wei's logical arguments. You want to know the truth about immigrant influence? Kearney shouted, pulling a small object from his coat pocket. Here's the truth. In his hand was a photograph, obviously recent and professionally taken. Kearney held it above his head like evidence in a trial, and his supporters responded with renewed anger. This shows my own brother, Kearney declared, his voice breaking with genuine emotion. Patrick Kearney, a good Irish Catholic boy who worked on the docks until foreign ideas destroyed his faith in American opportunities. Now, he spends his time in their institutions, lost to his family, lost to his heritage, lost to everything decent and American. The crowd fell silent as the full tragedy of Kearney's personal motivation became clear. This was not just political opportunism or economic anxiety. Dennis Kearney's campaign against immigrants had begun with a family division and a brother's transformation. Wei felt the mood shifting again, but this time not in his favor. Personal pain was more powerful than political logic, and Kearney's suffering was genuine, even if his solutions were misguided. I've seen what their ideas do to good families, Kearney continued, tears visible on his weathered face. I've watched my own blood turn away from everything our parents taught us, everything our community values. And you asked me to listen to reason. You asked me to consider their perspective. Kearney's supporters began to close ranks around their leader, their anger now focused not just on the immigrant community, but on Wei personally. He had become the symbol of everything they feared: foreign intelligence, corrupting influence, and the power to turn American families against their own traditions. Wei realized that he had made a tactical error by exposing the contradictions. In Kearney's movement, he had driven it toward its most emotional core, the people who were beyond rational persuasion and capable of the most extreme actions. As the crowd began to surge toward him, Wei finally decided to withdraw, but not to flee. Instead, He fired 3 shots from a small pistol into the air, the sharp reports echoing off the surrounding buildings like thunder. The gunshots had their intended effect, freezing the crowd in place and creating a moment of tense silence. In that silence, Wei heard something that changed everything. The sound of marching feet approaching from multiple directions. The California National Guard was finally responding to the night's violence. But they were not coming to restore order between equal communities. They were coming to protect established residents from what the authorities had decided to classify as an immigrant uprising. Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison led the first company of soldiers into Portsmouth Square, his men carrying rifles and orders to arrest any immigrant found participating in public disturbances. Harrison was a Civil War veteran who had fought at Gettysburg and Antietam, and he approached the situation with the same mentality that had served him in those earlier conflicts. Identify the threat, apply overwhelming force, achieve decisive victory. Disperse immediately, Harrison shouted through a speaking trumpet. All foreign nationals are to return to their designated areas. Any non-citizen found participating in public disorder will be arrested and held for deportation proceedings. The legal language was crucial. By defining the situation as immigrant disorder rather than community conflict, Harrison had framed the entire crisis in ways that made established residents appeared to be victims rather than participants. Wei understood the implications immediately. The night's violence had been transformed from a civil disturbance into something approaching military occupation, with immigrant Americans designated as a potentially hostile population rather than equal citizens with equal rights. As the soldiers began forming lines to separate the crowd from the immigrant quarter, Wei made a decision that would define the rest of his life. Instead of continuing to fight or attempting to negotiate with the authorities, he ordered his security team to stand down and return to their communities peacefully. Why? Asked Chen Ming, the young man who had first guided Robert Whitman to Chiang Wei's establishment years earlier. We can still resist. We have organization and resources. Wei shook his head, his eyes fixed on the soldiers' bayonets gleaming in the torchlight. We can fight them tonight and perhaps win. But tomorrow, there will be more soldiers, and more after that. Tonight, we choose between dying as martyrs and living as citizens. But living means we can continue building our community another day. The withdrawal to the immigrant quarter was humiliating but strategic. As Wei's team laid down their cameras and submitted to military escort, they appeared to be accepting defeat. But Wei was actually implementing a plan that he had been developing for months: the complete reorganization of immigrant resistance around legal and economic pressure rather than physical confrontation. Over the following weeks, as military supervision remained in effect and immigrant residents were confined to designated areas under official monitoring, Wei quietly activated a network that extended far beyond San Francisco. Using coded letters and trusted messengers, it coordinated with immigrant communities throughout California, establishing a unified response to what had become a systematic campaign of discrimination. The strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. Instead of fighting American authorities directly, Wei organized a comprehensive withdrawal of immigrant economic participation from the broader San Francisco economy. Immigrant businesses stopped serving non-immigrant customers. Immigrant workers resigned from positions in American-owned companies. Immigrant merchants stopped purchasing goods from American suppliers, disrupting trade relationships that connected San Francisco to markets throughout the Pacific region. Most importantly, immigrant professionals stopped providing services that the established community had come to depend on, leaving gaps in medical care, technical expertise, and international business knowledge that could not be easily replaced. Within a week, the city's economy was experiencing what would later be recognized as its first organized economic action, conducted with a sophistication that impressed even Wei's opponents. The economic pressure was immediate and severe. The same business owners who had publicly supported Kearney's movement found themselves facing financial crisis as their immigrant customers, workers, and suppliers disappeared overnight. Councilman Morrison received a delegation of prominent merchants demanding that he find some legal mechanism to force immigrant businesses to resume normal operations. "Councilman," pleaded Samuel Brown, whose hardware store had lost 40% of its revenue in a single week, "surely there must be some law that prevents this kind of economic disruption." Morrison's response revealed how completely the situation had been transformed by Way's strategy. "Gentlemen, what law requires people to do business with those who have declared them to be unwelcome? What legal principle forces workers to labor for employers who support their exclusion from the community?" The councilman's words carried a bitter irony that was not lost on his visitors. The same legal system that had been used to restrict immigrant rights was now protecting their right to withdraw from economic relationships with their opponents. But Way's most effective weapon was not economic pressure or legal maneuvering. It was documentation. During the chaos of the riots, his photographers had recorded not just the faces of participants, but the specific acts of violence and property destruction that had occurred. More importantly, they had captured images of police officers and National Guard soldiers participating in or tolerating crimes against immigrant residents. These photographs began appearing in newspapers throughout California and eventually reached national publications, creating a public relations crisis for San Francisco's civic and military leadership. Images of American soldiers standing by while crowds attacked immigrant businesses contradicted everything the country claimed to believe about law and order. The most damaging photograph showed Lieutenant Colonel Harrison himself apparently coordinating with Dennis Kearney while immigrant buildings burned in the background. The image was actually misleading. Harrison was receiving a report from a subordinate, not collaborating with Kearney, but the visual impression was devastating. When the photograph appeared on the front page of the New York Tribune under the headline, "American Military Collaborates with Anti-Immigrant Violence," the political consequences were immediate. President Rutherford Hayes ordered a federal investigation into the handling of the San Francisco crisis, and Harrison found himself facing a court-martial for failure to maintain military neutrality. But the real turning point came when Way released his most carefully guarded information. Detailed financial records showing the extensive business relationships between prominent San Francisco residents and immigrant enterprises. The documents revealed that many of the city's most vocal opponents of immigration were also their most important business partners. Theodore Whitman, whose son's transformation had sparked the original calls for investigation of immigrant institutions, was revealed to be a silent partner in 3 immigrant import businesses. His shipping company had transported over $2 million worth of goods for immigrant merchants over the previous 5 years, earning substantial profits from the very trade relationships he had publicly questioned. Dennis Kearney's own contradictions were even more spectacular. The labor leader who had built his career on anti-immigrant rhetoric owned stock in 2 companies that employed exclusively immigrant workers, and his family's boarding house had been quietly renting rooms to immigrant families at rates 20% higher than those charged to established residents. The revelations destroyed Kearney's credibility and fractured his movement. Many of his supporters felt betrayed by the discovery that their leader had been profiting from the very immigration he claimed to oppose. Others began to question whether their economic problems were really caused by immigrant competition or by the corruption and hypocrisy of their own leaders. Mickey Sullivan, the dock worker who had defended Chang Wei during the riots, became the spokesman for a growing number of working-class Americans who were reconsidering their positions. "We've been played for fools," he told a gathering at Murphy's Tavern. "They got us fighting each other, while they made money off all of us." Sullivan's transformation was particularly significant because it demonstrated the possibility of cross-racial solidarity among working-class San Franciscans. He began organizing integrated labor unions that included both immigrant and established workers, focusing their anger on exploitative employers rather than competing ethnic groups. But Way understood that individual conversions like Sullivan's, while important symbolically, were not enough to secure long-term protection for immigrant communities. What he needed was institutional change, legal precedents that would make it impossible for future demagogues to repeat Kearny's tactics. His opportunity came from an unexpected source: the federal investigation that had been triggered by the photographs of military misconduct. The investigating commission, headed by General Oliver Howard, was genuinely committed to uncovering the truth about what had happened in San Francisco. General Howard was a complex figure, a Union Army veteran who had commanded integrated units during the Civil War and had later served as commissioner of the Freedmen's Bureau. His experience with racial violence in the post-war South had given him insights into the dynamics of mob action that most of his contemporaries lacked thought when Howard arrived in San Francisco in March 1878. He brought with him a team of investigators, stenographers, and legal advisors who were prepared to conduct the kind of thorough examination that the earlier state hearings had avoided. Unlike Senator Sargent's politically motivated proceedings, Howard's commission was actually interested in facts rather than predetermined conclusions. The general's first act was to tour the immigrant quarter personally, accompanied only by interpreters and a single aide. What he found contradicted everything he had been told about the district by established officials. Instead of the centers of foreign conspiracy described by Kearny and others, Howard discovered a community that resembled immigrant neighborhoods throughout American cities. They were families with children, schools and religious institutions, legitimate businesses, and social organizations. The cultural institutions that had been the focus of so much attention occupied only a few buildings, among hundreds of ordinary residences and shops. More importantly, Howard observed something that established San Franciscans had consistently ignored: the evidence of systematic discrimination that forced immigrants into marginal occupations and substandard living conditions. Legal barriers prevented them from owning property in most areas of the city. Professional licensing requirements excluded them from many trades. Informal boycotts made it difficult for them to establish businesses outside of designated areas. Gentlemen,